Sorry, I'm just going to say hi, everyone, and hand over to the organizer of this, who's Perry, and then we're going to go in order like that.
Yes, so I'm Perry Mehrling, and I put together this panel, Past, Present, and Future, Money and Empire, and I think that you mostly know who we are. So let us save all that time, okay, and move immediately to Quinn, and then it will be me, and then it will be Mehrsa. And we are going to, those of us with presentations are going to be speaking from the podium there. So Quinn, you're up. I'm going to sit in the front row there so I can see it.
You can minimize that in the triple dots.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming and joining us in the platonic moment of early summer that has just somehow happened just at the moment that we have to be here.
That's
okay. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Quinn Slobodian. I teach at Wellesley College. And I am an odd person to start this because I'm not a financial historian or even an economic historian, let alone a specialist in the theory of money. But Perry invited me to speak, and I was inspired by reading his recent book, Money and Empire, about which he'll be talking in a minute, which is a title that he borrowed or took in homage to an earlier book about the gold standard in the British Empire. But his book is, as a lot of people probably know, about Charles Kindleberger and the dollar system after the Second World War. And as someone who is more of an international historian, and by extension then also a bit of a historian of the empires, the European overseas empires and the period of decolonization, I kept on waiting while reading Perry's book to find out exactly how he was defining empire. And I finished the book learning a lot of things about Kindleberger, but not knowing much about what category of empire was actually being deployed here. And it struck me that this was like, there was something here, right? There was something about the way that European international historians and American international historians have sort of obsessively wrangled with the category of empire in a way that some people who focus on the United States in particular can sort of take the idea of empire for granted. So what was being taken for granted, in effect, in Perry's book was that the dollar system itself acted as the US empire, the central pillar of the US empire, with some reference to the role of the United Nations organizations at the beginning. And so I started to ask myself, when did this happen? When did people who worked on finance part ways with people who worked on other parts of imperial history and colonial history? And so being a historian, I just went and read a bunch of books to try to help figure this out, and especially books that I felt like might sort of help me answer the question that was sort of possessing me. And so I specifically picked out books from the last 10 or 15 years that have been relatively well received or high profile, that have dealt specifically with the category of empire and colonialism, and somehow also the questions of political economy, and often, as I found out, questions of law in particular in international organizations. So what I sort of realized while reading these books, that I also sort of had a hunch about when I first was thinking about this in regards to Perry's book, was that a very particular category had displaced what had been previously a prominent category, the category of financial imperialism. This was a category that I feel like would have captured what Perry was describing relatively well, and yet for historians had increasingly sort of fallen off the table as a category that was used to describe the past in a helpful way. In the process, what the category that had really come to the fore is settler colonialism when talking about patterns of empire, whether it was 19th century, 20th century, or indeed bringing it up into the 21st century. So this is, this is an engram, it's a rough cut, obviously, it doesn't do everything, it just gives you a sense. This is going up to the year 2000, you might think, okay, not that striking. Look what happens if you bring it up to the year 2019. You get this kind of explosion of one category in particular, which I think, originates from more activist mobilizations and social movements, and then enters history, the discipline of history, the discipline of sociology, the discipline of anthropology and geography, in a way that is actually served to kind of elbow out what had been previously rather robust objects of study. So the question then for the historian is, how did this happen, right? How did we forget about financial imperialism, at least in comparison to the rising attention to this category of settler colonialism? And to think about this, I sort of went back to two texts, which I think helpfully bookend the century when financial imperialism was a dominant category, and then helped launch the century so far when settler colonialism seems like the dominant category for understanding what empire is. And those books are J.A. Hobson's Imperialism, which helps inspire Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, among other people. It helps inspire Arrighi, the whole world systems school, ultimately helps inspire David Harvey with this idea of empire as being driven primarily by economic interests in the metropole, who, in one of the many kind of hydraulic metaphors that Hobson uses that were then taken up by other historians and sociologists, kind of, they reach a moment of surplus and then overflow and seek places to flow into regions beyond the home country, and the armies and politicians of the home country effectively become kind of subordinated to the interests of the financiers that operate out of the City of London and later out of Wall Street. So empire is simply a financial process sort of channeled through political and military means. And it's a very extremely crude, economically deterministic way of understanding what imperialism is. And he acknowledges in the book itself that, in fact, the place for real investment and productive kind of activity would be to expand the consumer base of the working class, and that the way that you could stop imperialism is to do more redistribution. Trade unionism would be the best buttress against the expansion of imperialism. But this idea of overproduction and underconsumption as sort of twinned explanations that in a very one-line word sort of explain where empire came from in a one-line sense of, the role of finance produces empires, dominated a lot of history writing, a lot of social sciences throughout the 20th century, actually. Why then is the new imperialism kind of an inflection point? Well, David Harvey writes, this book it's a set of lectures that he gave at Oxford in the run-up to the American invasion of Iraq, which he talks about in the preface. And what he introduces in this book is a couple of, he talks more about a category that he talked about before, which is the category of the spatial fix, which is a way of kind of adding a geographical component to Hobson's idea, the idea that financial and economic actors need to go out and find new markets. But he also introduces this category of accumulation by dispossession, which in the intervening years, as settler colonialism has become an important category, accumulation by dispossession has similarly had this sort of torrid career in a lot of the social sciences, coming to focus on sites where things that had been previously held in common are sort of privatized or enclosed and taken into and commodified and turned into tradable and commensurate sort of objects of exchange. What Harvey talks about in that book, I think, sort of helps to launch two kind of trajectories of research that I would say you can still place a lot of books in one column or the other to this moment. He introduces what he calls the sort of a territorial logic of imperialism, by which states go out and directly annex and then govern territories, and a capitalist logic, which is theoretically universal, uses the metaphor of the molecular movement of capitalism a lot, and is sort of enabled by and sometimes obstructed by the territorial logic of states at different points across the sort of swath of world history. As I think scholars kind of chose one or the other effectively of these lines of inquiry, they then ended up using a set of categories that often were in kind of tension with each other. In the work that focuses on settler colonialism, there's an emphasis on political ideas of sovereignty. There's an assumption of a kind of telos of extermination, especially sort of demographic or extermination of peoples. There's a sense of finite resources. The world is a space that only has so much land that eventually will be enclosed. At which point there will have to be sort of violence to divide it up again. There's an emphasis on Marx's, but also I think importantly Polanyi's idea of enclosure and primitive accumulation as the thing that you should look at to understand where change is happening and why it's happening. Focus on land, enclosure, the frontier. Think about the commodity frontiers literature. I'm in a parallel conference yesterday that works on this category. And the idea that there's a kind of a one-wayness to history. There's a way that the territory gets divided up and it cannot really be reversed. Once the commons is gone, it's sort of gone forever. An emphasis on space, indigeneity, conquest, and formal empire. By contrast, you have, of course, all of this work in the history of capitalism and financial history that I think uses a different set of terms, right? There's an emphasis on acceleration rather than extermination, infinite money, technically, or at least theoretically, as opposed to finite resources, the problem of overproduction rather than the enclosure of finite resources, credit, debt, a focus on the centers of calculation, the centers of financial activity rather than the edges of dispossession, an idea that activities are cyclical rather than one way, a focus on time, commensurability, crisis rather than conquest, and in short, what I think the empire in Perry's book is mostly about is informal empire, right? I mean, in fact, one of the things that doesn't come up in the book much is sanctions, direct military intervention, even though, of course, Kindleberger himself is involved with that. It seems that the informal economy empire or the commercial empire of the dollar and American economic hegemony is what is most important. So just a couple more slides and I'll end up to sort of illustrate what I think is the kind of the rise to dominance in popular imagination of settler colonialism as the primary lens with which one can understand empire and the imperial past. It's a successful documentary on HBO from a couple of years ago called Exterminate All the Brutes, based on a book by Sven Lindqvist, based also on the work of Patrick Wolf, the idea that settler colonialism was about getting rid of the indigenous population while accessing the labor of an enslaved African population. I find more and more with my students especially, this is a framework that really hits for them. It makes sense to them intuitively. There's only so much land, people go out and get it. There are people who have to die for other people to live. All of these things would be very foreign to Hobson, right? I mean, Hobson actually thought that settler colonialism was the best possible outcome. That the bad imperialism was the imperialism that did not implant Caucasian populations and create neo-Europes beyond the shores of the British Isles. So some reversal has happened, I think, in our histories here. I want to end with mentioning a couple of what I think are kind of bridging concepts, so people who try to work between these two registers. In some cases, this idea of accumulation by dispossession can be used both in kind of financial terms and direct territorial terms. The historian Aaron Jakes is writing a book about global housemanization, right, talking about the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal and ways that surplus capital ends up going into these large-scale infrastructure projects globally. In the categories of predation, like in the work of Yamada Taylor, for example, the category of extraction itself, speculation, property as an asset. And some of the topics that I think historians have worked on that help bridge this helpfully is, one is mortgages. K.Sue Park's work, I know that she worked with Chris Dassan here at Harvard Law School, does this very well, focusing both on the kind of edge of dispossession, but also showing how finance plays a role. I think it's not a coincidence that indigenous histories are among the best at sort of not falling into one or the other of these categories. Claudia Saunt and Emily Connolly's work on annuities and the way they're used to finance the production of infrastructure, which then furthers the dispossession of indigenous communities in the 19th century United States, is quite extraordinary. Compensation in the sense of compensation for emancipated slaves is a very robust subject for historians right now. Catherine Hall has been important in creating the database of slave owners and the money that they were given after the loss of their enslaved property. Other categories up there: rent, sovereign debt, labor contracts, leases, insurance, scrip, money, expropriation, and sanctions. So one of the things that, and this is where I'll end, is we can see, I think, is changing in terms of the metaphors that could be useful. These are three of the metaphors that Hobson uses to describe the role of finance and empire. He calls finance the economic taproot of empire, where it's the thing at the center that is both bringing in all of the rewards, redistributing them, but also anchoring the project of empire. He talks about it as a governor, as something in an engine that is sort of allowing the right amount of fuel, so it's sort of centrally channeling levels of investment from the core out. And then sort of most dramatically, he talks about it as a parasite over and over, the idea that financiers are simply parasites on productive economic activity. I think that the recent histories, the ones that bridge this gap, use less a metaphor of a taproot and more of that of a chloroplast, the part of the cell structure in a plant that translates or that performs the act of photosynthesis. The work that is located at the frontier, but interested in the way that financial instruments and financial acts sort of end up circling back into the production of central power. Park's work on mortgages, Sant's work on annuities, I think are indicative of kind of a demoralization in a way, right? No one's really going to publish parasitism in an academic article right now. And there's a sense of a kind of a symbiotic relationship between finance and empire that can be found still, interestingly, primarily out there at the edges of empire, unless you're a Yusuf Cassis or someone writing about the financials, the floors of the stock exchange. Okay, so that's where I think I will leave it. And now we will hear from Perry, whose work inspired the thing in the first place. It's the PowerPoint, yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. And I move it along with this?
Yeah,
Or this, okay, fine. So thank you, Quinn, for starting us off. I actually am remembering when we first met at a little coffee house, and I had just read The Globalists, and I thought, oh, he tells the European story, I tell the American story, and so that's what we chatted about. But that's not what he's talked about today. It's much better what you talked about today, and it really leads this in, because of course Kindleberger was a globalist, okay, but of a very different kind than your neoliberal types. I forgot to say in the introduction to the panel, because I was eager to get going with it, that we have here a disciplinarily diverse panel, okay? So we have a historian, I'm actually an economist, although now I'm called a professor of international political economy, and we have a lawyer and we have an anthropologist. So we're covering all, and the very interesting thing is that we can talk to each other, okay? Because we're all interested in money. Okay, so and hopefully that will be a model for students here as well. This is also a conversation between people, but also between books. And so we were mentioning each other's books, and I encourage everyone to mention their books. My book is, in fact, the one that he mentioned. And that's not moving, so maybe that will do. That's not moving. Which one? Which, oh, so I need to point it toward there, okay. Okay, what I want, maybe this is the most important slide for this group, okay, at the very beginning. I want to emphasize that financial globalization, okay, is two things, okay. One is shadow banking or market-based finance, because this is the kind of banking that turns out to travel, okay? That it can become global banking. And so that's what my book 10 years ago was about, really about the rise of shadow banking and the stress test of shadow banking that was the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. Okay. But when I finished that book, I realized this book is really missing something. It was organized as a biography of the Fed, and so it was too domestic, really. You know, that the financial crisis was a test not just of shadow banking, but of the dollar, of the global dollar system. So then I started writing the next book, okay? It took me 10 years, but here it is, okay? Money and Empire. So that's what it is. So both of these books, I think, tell the story of the rise of the modern system. So that's what I'm going to say today. The system that lives today, okay, was built over this period. Financial globalization. So this is what the book is. It's 10 chapters. It's a biography of Kindleberger, as Quinn was saying. But what I want to emphasize today is that it's a biography of the global dollar. Okay, and it's a revisionist story about the rise of the dollar system. And the reason it works is because Kindleberger's dates and the dollar's dates are really lined up perfectly. You know, look, the Fed was born in 1913. Charlie was born in 1910. Okay, Bretton Woods, you know, happened in 1944. He, after a good war, he was. You mentioned that he was in the OSS, and lots of interesting stories there about Lend-Lease, the Marshall Plan. He was involved in all of those things. So I can tell the story just through the life of this one man. Bretton Woods. He goes to become an economist finally in 1948. He's 38 years old when he gets his first academic job. There's hope for us all. And then he is forced to retire in 76. This is the time when the dollar system seems to be falling apart. You know, Nixon has abdicated, and he has a third career, historical economist, but the dollar system is reborn really with the Volcker shock, the Plaza Accord. He did not live to see the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis, but we will see in many ways the evolution of the dollar system in response to those crises. Very much he anticipates. Like that's what the Darwinian evolution will lead to. It's just slower, okay? And it's slower because it's being resisted by US political authorities and other political authorities, but there's a certain logic that he believes in, and that's the logic that I want to tell you about here. So if you've had a course in international finance, you have a story about what happened, where the international financial system came from, and that's what the left-hand column is there, okay? That the international system was created from the head of Zeus, you know, by these finance ministers at Bretton Woods, this hotel up in New Hampshire. And that was about linking the dollar to gold and everything else to the dollar. It was multilateral, benign. It was a wonderful moment where, and the IMF was created there, in the US, hijacked the IMF role, relegating it, the collapse of Bretton Woods, 71, Volcker whips inflation, 79, Plaza. That story is the standard story that's in most textbooks, and it's a right-left agreement. Okay. I think that's not right. The dollar system began to grow really in 1931, okay, when sterling went off gold, okay. Everyone thought that we were just going to get the sterling system after World War I. It was just a matter of putting that thing back in place, okay, but it wasn't really going to work, okay, and it got increasingly difficult. In 1933, the central bankers gathered in London to try to work out a way of fixing the dollar against gold. John H. Williams was there. Okay, that name you're going to hear again. That all got blown up because of Roosevelt. The tripartite agreement to stabilize the dollar against gold and the French franc is 1936, and that's how Charlie got the job at the New York Fed. His job was to be the statistical backstop for that operation of stabilizing stabilizing sterling against the dollar. From this point of view, the key institution is not the IMF. The key institution is the BIS, just created after World War I, because that's organizing short-term capital flows between currencies. And in Bretton Woods, the key institution is the World Bank, because that's about long-term capital flows to the global south, which will overcome stagnation. In his way of thinking, the role of the United States is to stabilize the core of the system. And if you stabilize the core of the system, everything's going to be fine. Others can stabilize around that. And so that's that he's involved in at the State Department. The Anglo-American loan, that's about stabilizing the core, sterling and the dollar. The Marshall Plan, about integrating the US with Europe. And the collapse of Bretton Woods, okay, is really Nixon's crime of 1971, trying to torpedo Bretton Woods and say, we don't want to be the leader anymore. But the bankers wouldn't let him kill it.
The bankers created the Eurodollar system offshore. And then the US said, oh, okay, I guess we will lead this thing. And Volcker came in 1979. And so PLAS is about putting together this global dollar system. So it's a revisionist economic history. I'll say less about the next in the interest of time. It's a revisionist analytical frame too. For those of you who know the Money View, my MOOC, really this key currency approach that is what Kindleberger is responsible for, following John H. Williams, who was a professor at Harvard and was his boss at the New York Fed in his first job. The international monetary system emerges from practice, okay? There's an economic logic that's driving it. The international dollar is the private dollar. It's the liability of the global banks, okay? It's not the liability of the Fed. There's one market. It's not a Westphalian story. There's one global money market. There's one global capital market. And the dollar is at the apex of that. US monetary policy is world monetary policy. All of this is not what you're learning in international finance classes, which is the left-hand column, okay, again, there. So again, it's a minority approach in understanding the international monetary system. This also is the story in my book. So it's an extension of the Money View to the international. That's the idea. Key currency approach is that extension. That also is there. And so the key players here, so the book is organized as anti-Triffin, anti-flexible exchange, so it's, if you have taken a course, you know Triffin, you know Harry Johnson, the monetary theory of the balance of payments, you know about the new international economic order, you know about the Mundell trilemma, okay? There's an alternative to all of these, okay, that Kindleberger fought his whole life. That's what the book is about. But I want to get through that. So here's his story. His life was about integrating the dollar with Europe, extending the dollar system to bring Europe, the reconstruction of Europe, but then bringing Europe into the fold. The next stages of this, and that went through various crises and so forth, the next stages of this was to integrate Asia, and after the global financial crisis, what we've essentially seen is the integration of the global south, okay, into the global dollar system. This here is a chart that I love from Macaulay and Ito at BIS, a key currency view of the global imbalances. I'm highlighting the word key currency so that you see that he's identifying himself with this minority tradition of John H. Williams and Kindleberger. Macaulay was a student of Kindleberger's. And he's showing this expansion of the dollar system across the face of the globe. From this point of view, when we understand crises, as Quinn was saying, the crisis is the key point, okay? There's sort of two things going on. There's a global inherent instability of credit that is global now because it's a global money market, it's a global capital market. So that's what's striking every country. Every country is having to contend with this fact that there's this dynamic of the system that is larger than itself, including the United States. However, the United States has a special rule because it's at the apex here. US monetary policy is global monetary policy. So that cycle is the result of two things. It's the result of the inherent instability of global credit, but also US monetary policy that are moving back and forth to cause that fluctuation. Again, I give the citation there, so if you wanted to look and see, that's just an image there about instability. Here is another image about instability, and what it looks like. What it looks like technically is how is this system tied together? It's a global dollar system, but there are all these other currencies, actually. There are all these other countries. Well, what is important here is the swap network that is tying together the dollar with the most important other currencies, which would be the yen and the euro. And that's what you're sort of seeing in the left-hand slide there, is the cross-currency basis against the US dollar of the major currencies. And you see that is that falls apart in crisis. Those vertical lines are the global financial crisis and the euro crisis. And the COVID crisis, the same thing happened, okay? What's backstopping that are these liquidity swap lines between the major central banks. The Fed became the global central bank as a consequence of the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, okay? That it activated all these lines and that's what stopped this from causing a Great Depression. That's what put put a floor into the global financial crisis. That's the story. story I tell in my first book, okay? But then that became permanent after the Euro crisis, and managing that, and in the COVID crisis, it happened instantaneously, so you don't even know that it happened, okay? You never even felt that this was going to be a global crisis, but it was, okay? And you can tell by looking at what happened to the swap spreads. Am I speaking too fast? That's what comes from living in New York for 30 years. So here's my last slide, an image to give you a sense of the hierarchy of money and the hierarchy of backstops. Okay? What has been put in place as a consequence of 2008-9 and also the Corona crisis of March 2020 is a system of liquidity swaps linking the major 6 currencies. I call those the C6 liquidity swaps, which are unlimited and permanent. Kindleberger would have died to have something like this, you know, but there were these Basel swaps and you had to hide them and not tell the government that you were doing them, and he thought that the US government is never going to put up with this, you know. Or maybe we could have the BIS be the world central bank, you know, maybe we could get Europe, have them have a seat on the FOMC, you know. He couldn't figure out how to square the circle between the globalization of finance and money and the localization of politics. Okay, the governments are local, but money is global. How do you make that go? This is how you make it go. At least this is how we are making it go. We'll see in the next crisis how this works. So what I'm showing there, the image is, so that was the global north is the C6 liquidity swaps, and then in the Corona crisis, this is extended in some sense to the global south through the FEMA repo facility, so that the Fed is willing to let anybody come to the discount window if they have a treasury bill, okay, and it will give them reserves. It will give them dollar reserves, okay, and not anybody. FEMA stands for Foreign and International Monetary Authorities, something like that. So Credit Suisse can't go there, okay, but central banks can go there. The IMF can go there. The World Bank can go there, and get dollars. So it's a discount window for the globe, okay? And then these central banks can take those dollars and lend them on to their domestic banks and so forth. So the US, this is important. The Fed is the lender of last resort, international lender of last resort for the world, okay? That's what it did in Corona crisis. That is, in the global south, not only you know, for very short-term borrowing. Okay, so that's why I'm showing that gray thing for the global south, you know, is only for short-term borrowing, okay? The liquidity swaps for the C6, for the global north, are longer term. These basis swaps are 3 months, you know, so money market funding of capital market lending is being financed in the global north. And in the United States itself, we all know that the Fed stands behind all maturities because it's standing behind the government bond market, and in the Corona crisis, the corporate bond market as well. So the degree of backstop that the Fed is providing depends on where you are. At the core of the system, the Fed is backstopping everything, okay? And out beyond that, in the C6, not the really long-term stuff, but it will lend to central banks and let them do whatever they want. And in the periphery, the immediate settlement constraint, the thing called liquidity crises that cause currencies to fall off a cliff, okay? It's backstopping that. Okay, we're going to see how that worked, how that works in the next crisis, because this is in fact a globally unstable credit system, and it will get a chance to be tested. I think Kindleberger would never have imagined that this would be politically possible. Okay, but it's become politically possible because of this hierarchical structure that's been built. That the U.S. citizen does not feel, oh, we're subsidizing foreigners. We don't want to do that, okay? And foreigners don't feel, oh, the US has exorbitant privilege and they're imposing this all on us. You know, so there's a political balance that is being created in this set of institutions. And that's where we are right now, okay? But it's a moving target. So this is bringing you up to date. Okay.
We were all planning on not preparing, and I'm the idiot that didn't actually prepare. So I want to bring, okay, so the book that I'm not finishing, 6 years in, is also trying to figure out a revisionist history, and then where do you go back? How far back do you go to when it got screwed up, right? And what do you revise? And I'm going to say, look, I'm going to go back to the 60s moment, but you do have to go back to Aristotle here, right? Because like the original chartalist theory came with Aristotle is Alexander the Great's, the not so great's, philosopher, right? And so you're bringing in who came up with money and the theories about money before the Greeks. And it was, I'm serious, right? Like this, it was the Ibn Khaldun, who's an Arab scholar. This is the Silk Road. The heyday of the Silk Road goes from the 1300s until the 1450, when the Spanish try to conquistador their way through the Silk Road. That closes off, they go here, do the conquest, right? Find India this way. And that's when the gold standard starts, and that's where hundreds of years of war starts. So unless we're going to the principle, the essence of what money is, we're not getting an empire. I think the chartalist versus the other theory was at this moment where you had to pick, because Alexander the Great was not open to what the previous empires had done, which is to let people keep their autonomy, and women also. So I think this is all embedded. So going back to that 60s moment, if I'm telling a revisionist history of empire here, I think the person whose dollar privilege, the person who has a dollar or whatever yen, whatever privilege, is the person who can unblock the Suez Canal in a war. And that happens in 1956 with Eisenhower. World War II is ending, and the British and the French are trying to get the Egyptians to open the Suez Canal. The Egyptians, all sorts of war, but it's also against the Seven Sisters oil companies, right? So OPEC, all of these organizations were in line trying to get out from under the British corporate, right? It was already dominion. I mean, if you're talking about Iran or the entire Middle East, it was already empire by corporation. So it was long gone. Like the empire by state was not what was happening at that time. And so OPEC, so in 1960 is the year of Africa. So between 1960 and 1970, every single country becomes independent and goes through some civil war. And in that mix, you try to nationalize or at least get sovereignty over your corporate, right, your resource. And I think that's when the fight was lost. So I would say, going back to that, and Quinn has done, I think, the best work on this, right? Imperium versus dominium. The Nazis are like, oh, we're gonna do imperium. The Hayek, I'm very summarizing. Hayek and the neoliberals say dominium, right? Or whatever, that's where we're at. And I think the last panel was just like, which one works still? And I think dominium's like long gone. Looking at what many of us saw during the transition and otherwise is that there aren't levers in imperium that could rein in dominium if we wanted. And I would say that goes back into that mix. So my presentation was supposed to be called The Strange Career of Law and Economics. And so I'm saying that in that, law and economics comes in as like the worm, and I'll call it not neoliberalism, I'll call it just corruption. And it comes in between 1968 and 1970 in the Nixon administration. And within those 2 years, I think there is like a genuine battle. You have like GM, Ralph Nader versus Lewis Powell. And I think it's Lewis Powell in the Supreme Court that corruption worm comes in, and law and economics is a byproduct of that. And so every debate we're having over these economic principles wasn't even good faith at the time, right? So all of this to say, so I think going back, so now I'm going to bring race into it, because you either at that point keep your post World War II promises to not do empire, to not do torture, to treat every country as one vote. So when in 1960, when all 20 African countries get a UN vote in 1960, and then until 1970, now we have the G77. It went from like 5 countries in charge of the whole world for 500 years, and now you have 120 or something. What are you going to do with all those votes, right? So you, as Quinn has demonstrated, you take sovereignty away from everybody, including the homeland. And this is one of your books, Uncommon, the Koja, what's his name? Yeah, talks about the boomerang effect, right? So the boomerang effect, this is Hannah Arendt and Frantz Fanon and the Martinican, Aimé Césaire talks about, look, you don't go and colonize and justify colonization, i.e. the gold standard and racial hierarchies, eugenics, and not have that come back in the rhetoric of the Nazis. And I think you're seeing that exact same thing come in through Hayek here, right? The scarcity, right? Tragedy of the commons, all of that stuff is like embedded in eugenics. So, you know, I think sometimes when we're on the surface of like, let's go at the assumptions, but not at the root, where if like the root is in this deeply entrenched like hierarchy of value, i.e. like gold, God said gold is more valuable than other things because it's essentially valuable. And then God said white and male or whatever, Europe and America versus the colonies. And so those come together, you know? And so I mean, I would say, so now the positive is like, when you go back to that history, when you look at Aristotle, so there's actually Adam Smith, his notes have been released, and he cited this guy named Xenophon, who was like a mercenary between the Persians and the Greeks. So Xenophon, which oddly means like not xenophobic, it means like listening to other people. He was like a translator between Aristotle, Plato, and like the Arab and the Persian scholars at the time of like that, you know. I mean, look, Thucydides is a Greek who wrote the Greco, right, like the Peloponnesian War history. So there's this whole other history of like what happened on the Persian Arab side, right, which is not what the Greeks saw. And in that way, you're going back into these other scholars of money and of markets and of the free market. So Adam Smith is citing Xenophon, who's citing Ibn Khaldun. The Arabs actually, the Bedouins created these principles of the free market that then get translated into Adam Smith. Adam Smith is telling the Scottish, after Mary, bloody Queen of Scots, right? Hey, maybe we should trade, right? Instead of like do piracy. But all of that time, the theory of the market was very much like a trust-based system. You're not trading silk, you're trading sort of repeat customers, blah, blah. I mean, we can go into this is not the panel, but if we're not going back to that, I think we're bringing in these assumptions. And this is what I love about settler colonialism versus empire, because I was waiting for like, what is settler colonialism? What is colonialism when it's internal as well? Because it's not just the colony and the metropole, right? The metropole also now has, I mean, the fact that student loans are on the chopping block with the Supreme Court, like the Wall Street Journal is like, is this the first case that affects real people? It's like, no, of course not, right? Like real people's wallets. It's the first time students are real people, right? And have that power taken away from them. So I think it's just that expansion that's the same thing. So anyway, I mean, this is an open question. If we're to take money out of empire and do money in democracy and go back to the basics, not back, but to like the basic principles, assuming kind of we're cleaning out the assumptions, we're back to the principle of like money is, as Christine said in her book, it is just water, society. That's kind of what Ibn Khaldun would have said also. And unless we're talking about that, I just think it's just empire all the way down. I don't know.
And so now we have our commentator, who has his PowerPoint. Shall we go down and watch it again?
It's like musical chairs.
And then we'll open it up. No. We also have to share. Okay, okay. Simple. Thank you to the presenters for putting this together. Again, it's been a while. I remember fondly the first conference, so I'm really looking forward to this one. Thanks, Chris and her team. So what I'll do is I will first respond to Quinn, who I've just heard because that wasn't pre-circulated, and then I'll respond to and Mehrsa, and then I'll respond to Perry, which are the slides. And there are some common themes. So Quinn made the distinction between settler colonialism and financial colonialism, or settler imperialism and financial imperialism. And in many ways, that's an interesting distinction, but in many ways, they're two sides of the same coin. Because, and I'll just go through 3 or 4 points comparing old imperialism and new imperialism in the way that you did. Because the startling fact about old imperialism was that the overwhelming majority of long-term capital flows from the core went to white settler colonial countries, right? That's where capital flows went, and there's a sort of vast literature on this, right? So it's not that India didn't get some railway investment, but if you just look at it sort of quantitatively, the vast majority of it went to. So there's that kind of flip side to it as well. It's not finance over here and settle over here. They're sort of the same phenomenon. But then there are 3 other phenomena that I think are important by way of comparison between old imperialism and new imperialism. The second, I'll go through the old imperialism ones first, and then I'll compare it to the new imperialism. So first one, long-term capital flows go to white settler colonial areas, overwhelming majority. The second one, that's sort of long-term capital. Short-term capital is you have a kind of impounding of imperial liquidity, if you like, in the City of London. So India, this is de Cecco's work, Money and Empire, the first Money and Empire. India runs a current account surplus with Britain, but India doesn't get its hands on the gold. That's all impounded in London. India gets, local rupees. And so what ends up happening is that sort of you have and that's not a voluntary exercise. In fact, part of the sterling crisis post-war is that the empire is going to liquidate its sterling balances because they have the right now to do that, whereas they didn't have the right to do that during the empire. So that's about impounding short-term flows, and it's discipline, to use money view terms, discipline for empire, elasticity for the city, right? So that what enables the gold standard critically, one of the key enabling conditions is this kind of short-term liquidity flow. I'll compare that to new imperialism in a second. The third feature of old imperialism is that speculation is stabilizing. Is that that financial flows move around in a way that support the gold standard, that support the sterling standard. And they do that because of the absence of democracy. This is a very old Karl Polanyi point, right? And Polanyi's point is that the absence of democracy means that Eichengreen is built on this. That the Bank of England has a credible commitment to raise interest rates and smash the economy if required to defend gold parity, right? And because the market knows that, every time sterling moves away from the gold points, the markets front run, stabilizing speculation, and do for the Bank of England what it doesn't have to do it anyway, right? They automatically move flows in the direction because they know that the credible commitment is there to smash the economy. That goes away when democracy comes up. You can no longer do that, so speculation becomes destabilizing rather than stabilizing. And then, of course, you have what Gallagher and Robertson called the imperialism of free trade. So you already had the informal empire, Latin America. Classically, it's not as if, so there was and the way Gallagher and Robertson put it is that there's a kind of continuum of strategies, that when it made sense to kind of formally plant the flag, you did that. And when you could actually sort of run the imperial show which is a standard. Smith understood this also. Social markets, raw material, spatial temporal fix is a part of it. But if you could do that in the absence of formal colonization, which is after all expensive, then all well and good, you can do it through informal empire. So they don't see the distinction between formal and informal as a kind of as a sharp binary, but a kind of continuum. Contrast this now to the so-called new imperialism, whereas you had financial flows going to white settler colonies. Today, most foreign direct investment goes to the OECD. That's just the pattern of flows. Yes, again, doesn't mean China doesn't get large foreign direct investment. Doesn't mean India doesn't as well. But in absolute terms, but in relative terms, where are the flows going? It's still very much a kind of inside the developed kind of universe. In the place of impounding of imperial liquidity in the way that happened to India, you have the phenomenon of the periphery lending to the core, right? You have East Asia, China, especially putting its surpluses in T-bills and sort of capital flowing uphill, if you like, not from the core to the periphery. And there's been various ways in which, and there's various reasons for this, right? The big reason for this is, of course, self-insurance. That in a world of open capital, which is the world of empire, you need to build a kind of buffer of dollar liquidity to buffer yourself from hot money. The genesis of this, of course, is the 98 Asian crisis. There's a couple of other sources of money flowing the other way in what could call a sort of imperial tribute sense. One is that it's the outcrop of Chinese industrial policy and Japanese and Korean industrial policy. Before that, you're exporting, you have a bunch of surpluses, you want to keep your currency down, you have to, the operations of that generate large surpluses that you have to store somewhere in foreign currency. But there is also a kind of I think it's, we would be naive to say that there isn't a geopolitical element to this. Some of the largest owners of foreign official owners of US government debt are, of course, American geopolitical satellites, Japan, the oil producers of West Asia, and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of, this is voluntary in a kind of Westphalian sense of states are choosing to do this, but there is a kind of informality to this as well. And lastly, speculation is destabilizing. That's exactly why East Asian currencies and those who can afford it construct this kind of buffer of dollar liquidity, precisely because flows are destabilizing. The one way to deal in, to use the language of the financial markets, the one way to deal with sovereign risk is just to eliminate the sovereign. So that's formal empire, right? You don't have to worry. The British grandma investing in Indian railways doesn't have to worry about the Indian sovereign because there ain't one, right? So there is no sovereign risk. But in a world of formal sovereignty and informal empire, you have to do it in a slightly different way. And the home bias, all of these are kind of terms of art, that results in this flows not being actually stabilizing, but destabilizing, as opposed to and the key here again is the fact of democracy coming up against finance, right? You cannot credibly commit to smash an economy to maintain inflation targeting or to maintain fiscal rectitude or any of the other kind of neoliberal shibboleths. And therefore, finance is kind of jittery, right? Where finance could sleep on that, finance is stabilizing. Where finance cannot sleep on that, so the current world kind of brings democracy and finance in that way into a kind of, so we have not the kind of imperialism of free trade, but the sort of imperialism of free trade plus finance, if you like. It was always plus finance, but the financial element is a little more kind of overstated here. And so to Mehrsa's point, it was definitely already kind of, empire by colonialism, by corporation, but the kind of broader macro structuring is slightly different. Let me then move to, so that's Quinn's paper. Let me move to Perry's paper and respond to this very briefly. So The one startling fact about the key currency approach, which I think it has to reckon with, and this is the kind of, if you like, imperial element of this, is that why is it that all the key currencies, our best monies, are monies of states or monies of their national monies, right? This is this dichotomy that Perry was pointing to earlier, right? They all happen to be the liabilities of national-based central banks, right? Is it, and so I would get to kind of Kindleberger's point about the structure of the dollar liquidity system, the dollars, the US as functioning as a global bank, by asking the question this way: can there be a kind of non-national world money? Right? Why is it that national money, what is it about national money that is performing the role of world money? Why is there no non-national money to do that, right? And Perry I think over eggs the pudding a little bit when he talks about Darwinian evolution and so on. There's a lot of constitutional moments. He himself mentioned various conferences and so on and so forth. But even for argument's sake, you say this emerges from market practice. You still have to ask the question: why is it that cold, calculating capitalists choose a national money to bank in? Right? What is about the structure of this that is they're not pushing for a kind of non-national money, right? And just to plug my book a little bit here, the answer is that national balance sheets configured to pull together sort of with a certain kind of political cement, what I call political mutualization. If they can do that, if certain national balance sheets can do that at scale, they can then issue a liability, a monetary liability that is both flexible and stable at scale, which is to say, it can perform the functions of world money. Now, to say that market practice therefore selects certain national monies is emphatically not to make the kind of chartless point that the state always has the best money, right? The fact that it does not therefore follow from that the states have the best money, right? So we should, it's certain states configured in a particular way. You need the scale and you need the financial plumbing. So this then gives us a bit of a dilemma, right? And I would pose a dilemma in the following sense. If a sovereign balance sheet provides world money, you get an exorbitant privilege. And there is no kind of pussyfooting around this point, right? If your liability is money, your survival constraint is massively relaxed, right? Because your liability is means of payment, okay? So there's no way around this fact. That is an exorbitant privilege. And this entity is a sovereign, sort of self-interested entity with local politics, okay? That entity is therefore going to be very hard to discipline. Again, even in money view terms, a kind of robust credit system requires a balance between discipline and elasticity. And if the provider, the core element, is undisciplined, and it is undisciplined because, I mean, we had this long literature, Janos Kornai and the soft budget constraint of the socialist firm is what kind of led to the atrophying and the inefficiency of the socialist firm. This is the softest budget constraints, applying to the strongest of states. So how can that not be undisciplined, right? And that amplifies, it's not that there wouldn't be instability in credit anyway. You're projecting credit into the future. There is inherent instability. But that inherent instability is amplified to the degree that there is no exit, right? If we don't have a world of outside money, it becomes very hard to discipline. And we'll talk about Kindleberger's response to that in a second. So that's one part of it. If the sovereign balance sheet provides world money services, that balance sheet is hard to discipline. If a non-sovereign provides global liquidity services or global world money, right? Talk about IMF or Kindleberger's favorite, the BIS, or Keynes's favorite, Bancor, and so on and so forth. It simply would be credible. In the absence of a political settlement to mutualize sovereign balance sheets to backstop that, right? To which anyone can issue crisis liquidity, but it's got to be accepted, right? And in order to stop a crisis, Kindleberger knows this well, he calls it crisis liquidity versus trend liquidity. Crisis liquidity has to be unlimited. How can a non-sovereign balance sheet do that if it's not hooked up to a larger set of balance sheets? And you do that through a kind of political mutualization. None of these entities were able to secure that political mutualization, and therefore they kind of fail. So it's for me axiomatic that the required mutualization for non-national provision of world money cannot occur. This CPK's Charles Poor Kindleberger absolutely recognized this, of course, right? He understood that in order to get an efficient global lender of last resort, you need some kind of mutualization. He was just an optimistic cosmopolitan. He thought it would happen. He thought when he was writing in the 1980s, in fact, we were on the way to it happening, right? And this is beyond, this point goes beyond the kind of point about political preferences, vitiating economic logic, because ontologically the world is a distinct thing. Kindleberger made a lot of mileage out of the analogy between the Federal Reserve System and local Federal Reserve banks mutualized with a Federal Reserve Board in DC, but that's within one political community. The world is, for better or worse, not a single political community, right? It's distinct political communities. And that's the world where we are. So for me, we're stuck with this national provision of world money. We have to kind of work our way through this. Kindleberger's solution to this was twofold. One, leadership. We know that it's a kind of noblesse oblige, if you will, right? We know that one of the nations is going to have this exorbitant privilege. We just want them to be leaders as opposed to predatory hegemons. Right? And there's a public good element to this, there's an enlightened self-interest element to this, but that's what he's pushing for, leadership, and therefore free discounting in a crisis and so on and so forth. We've got that finally with the swap lines, but that's very much a backstop. It's not, right, that's lender of last resort. The lender of first resort is still happening through New York and through normal New York-based intermediation. So the question is, and what it seems that for Kindleberger, this was a kind of pragmatic solution. That in effect, he still wanted to get the BIS to be the national, that there would be a kind of non-national central bank, global bank eventually. And that's the idea that we sort of moved to, but I've just argued that that's not even possible in principle. So this is the world we are in. And I'll stop here by saying that if that's the case, then what we perhaps have to do is move financial intermediation services away from New York to local national economies and enable them to do it themselves, which is very much the world of that respects sovereignty, right? So this is not to say that it's going to close up and be kind of autarkic blocks. There are deep complementarities between the global north and global south. Kindleberger himself recognizes this, but this is another kind of cosmopolitan vision, if you like, right? Kindleberger's was a cosmopolitan vision from money and the globe as a kind of ultimate currency area, and so on and so forth, which is certainly one version of one cosmopolitan vision. But there are others, right? Just to cite Keynes, not that I'm a fully sort of converted Keynesian or anything, but Keynes, for instance, in his self-sufficiency, national self-sufficiency kind of essay, argues that finance should be primarily national, right? And so you can do it's financial intermediation, where this sits and how it's configured. Again, we can rebalance it as opposed to having it extremely centered on New York. You can kind of re-gear it to have more local kind of, and this is of course every successful case of development in the global south, and indeed in the global north, as we know from Gershenkon's work, is predicated on development banking. National finance, not international finance. So if finance is then primarily national, you can have another kind of cosmopolitanism, the kind of we are sort of celebrating here, the cosmopolitanism of ideas, of culture, of that kind of exchange. And I recognize that this may be a minority view, but then so was Kindleberger's. So let me end there.
So I think we should just go right to questions. We have 20 minutes because I think so we have successfully left time for questions, which seems to be a problem in this conference. Okay, but maybe because we spoke too fast. So who has the microphones?
Yeah, I can definitely, and also, for folks joining online, I noticed that we haven't taken any questions from our online participants yet, but I will pull up our participant list and, or do we have a Q&A?
We're having a Q&A now.
Sorry.
Yeah, so let me, should I call?
Go ahead, try it.
Oh, but you're the.
I can-
I can keep, well, I'll do it, okay. So let's begin with Chris in the back, of course. Because she said she starts from the bottom and I start from the top, and so now she's gonna explain what she meant by that.
So actually, Perry, I was gonna ask you to respond to Anush. So I have two questions. One is, Anush, I loved the commentary, and I'd love to hear Perry on your interpretation of, is this on? Or am I just-
Doesn't sound on.
I'd love, I don't really need it, but I'd love to hear your response to his interpretation of Kindleberger and where you stand, and I loved the way you threw in Keynes as well. And then I also have a question for Quinn, which is, I also found fascinating the comparison between financial imperialism and settler colonialism. And I wonder if that's about historiography and economics, and in particular, whether with the decline and eventual death of economic historians in history departments, right? So went financial history and the terminology that included, and then the sort of move to social and cultural history brought us settler colonialism, including as those people became interested in economics, they start making inroads, but their vocabulary is very much a social historian's vocabulary, if you will. So I wonder if that's going on. So questions for each of you. Mehrsa, we'll get to you next.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Do you wanna go first, or should I?
Yeah, maybe mine will be quickest, I think. Yeah, first, thank you to Anush. For sure, I wasn't sort of suggesting that one can't have financial explanations of the 19th century practice of it.
It looks much more silly than it is.
Amazing recovery. It was caught on the
That's a good
screen.
distraction. That's
10
a
out of
good
10. 10. Where was I?
Where was
You can have both.
You can have both. I mean, my point was more the meta one that I think Chris was picking up on, which is like, not that finance isn't in a history of empire, but why has it been absent from recent high-profile international histories of empire and decolonization? What happened to it? And I think there's both a negative and positive explanations. I think the negative explanation is along the lines of what you're saying, which is just the sense that economic history had been exiled to economics departments for some time and then started to disappear even from there. And the positive explanation is, I think there were a lot of things happening globally in the early 2000s that made it seem very relevant to talk about settler colonialism as a kind of a master category, from kind of the pink tide indigenous struggles to the, as I suggested, the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, the attempt to recuperate empire as a category by high profile political commentators, Israel-Palestine churning on, pipeline protests, the movement of the frontiers of extraction deeper into places where they really disrupt people's lives, the indigeneity as a central category, especially in human rights language, and sort of fourth world struggles in the 90s and 2000s. So I think you're right, but I think it still does confuse me because Graeber, debt, Occupy, I mean, it wasn't as if we had permanently estranged ourselves as non-economists from a language of economic history. The histories of capitalism in the United States were, of course, a place where this was happening, but it was sort of, profoundly national and parochial kind of in its concerns. I think the history of capitalism is mostly engaged in the national drama of enslavement and abolition and the failure to come back from that for very good reasons. And for some reason, it never really reached across the Atlantic. And it's not a coincidence that Kojo Karam, who Mehrsa mentioned, is a lawyer, but he writes one of the more high-profile books in the last few years of the way that empire was an economic practice that had left kind of legacies that are hardwired into economic practices too.
Can I add, I'm just gonna use privilege of panelists, but like, you know, the 1974 Nobel in economics, like Memorial Nobel to economics, went to Hayek and Gunnar Myrdal. And Gunnar Myrdal was like the Swedish economist that was like global world trade, like that was the pivot right there. And so I think to bring the academy back into it, like, and this is where law and economics is strange careers, like it comes in already tainted, so we can't know. I mean, it's like, it's almost like the very idea of like knowing what can we know in money and finance. Why aren't we talking about money and finance? Because it got like put in this very scientific, like, you know, a space. And many people have talked about it, but to bring it back into the policy is like the policy also, when Reagan goes in, he goes in with all of Heritage and AEI, and that's already embedded in.
Yeah, I mean, the disappearance of Marxism from economics departments is obviously something too. The fact that political economy just was reduced to its rum presence in Amherst here is, you know, something that evacuated. It's a good rum.
So let me respond to the first question, which asked me to respond to Anush. Oh, wait, there's so many things there that I can't really do that, you know. But maybe just one or two provocations. Is the dollar a national money? I mean, you make the point, which maybe other people missed, you know, that the merchants are deciding in what currency to denominate their invoices and so forth, and I think that is the place to start. Okay, that the community that is important to understand here is the community of the merchants. Okay, the traders. Okay, which is a global community. And so there's this kind of natural globalized quality to money. And certainly in the Middle Ages and so forth, before there was the modern nation state, you know, there were always merchants and they were always trading with each other, and they had their own merchants' money, which was very often better than the king's money. And that's why the kings had to do business with the merchants when they wanted to fight wars, you know. So this notion that the state's money is naturally better, this is a modern creation. It's a creation of modern states. So that's a point there. This I'm going to say, so this quote from Keynes about self-sufficiency, okay, always comes up, okay. This is Keynes, you know, after World War II, pissed off that the US is taking over the world, okay, and he's thinking that little England may have to be self-sufficient, okay, and he's trying to make a virtue of that. Okay, I think that this is taken out of context, and it's not good advice to emerging market economies to say, so I got it wrong. It's not World War II. It's the collapse of the Sterling system. Okay, 1931. So thank you. Yeah, it's the collapse of the Sterling system. So it's still taken out of context because the Sterling had been the dominance of the whole world, and now suddenly it's not at all. And he's trying to make a virtue of necessity. And I don't think that is consistent with the rest of his work, and it certainly is not a viable opportunity. Here's the second thing I want to say to Anush. What you say about the global capital flows is maybe a little out of date. Okay, what has happened since the global financial crisis, and I have slides about this, but not in this presentation. Okay, is that essentially after the global financial crisis, the repair of balance sheets in the global north meant that there was no total credit expansion at all in the north. It was all in the south. Okay, and a lot of it was really long term. Okay, that story about capital flowing uphill, that's a story before the financial crisis. Okay, after the financial crisis, there's bonds for the first time in the world, in world history. You know, the emerging markets are discovering they can issue dollar-denominated bonds in global capital markets, and that they're snatched up, and they're not snatched up by New York. They're snatched up by Japan. Okay, and they're financed in the Eurodollar market in Europe. It's an offshore dollar market, an offshore capital market, and an offshore money market, both. That's the sense in which I want to say, is dollar national money? It's true that the backstop of this global dollar system is the Fed.
ultimately, okay? It's a very indirect backstop. You know, it's through the central banks and so forth. But this is not the operation of New York. This is the operation of London and Singapore and the way that the central bankers in the global south dealt with COVID, okay, by spending some of those reserves in order to prevent their currencies from falling off a cliff. It all worked. And why did it work? It worked because the swap line stabilized the North. Swap line stabilized the North, and that gave policy space for the central banks of the global South. It worked for COVID. We'll see if it works for other things. But so those are just two ideas. There's lots of other things. We'll be talking for the rest of our lives. You can see you sort of have a window on our ongoing conversation here. But let's get some more voices, shall we?
Hold on, I'm gonna two-finger this like national dollar, because there's sanctions, right? We have sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Iran. And the sanctions do prove to be pretty crippling on the people to whom they are imposed, especially the people. The governments are the smugglers that can get around the sanctions.
Well, we can talk about sanctions, but not now. Yes, so.
There's a two-finger back there,
What, are you just raising your hand? Okay, well, so let's just go from in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, and why don't we have a couple at once, okay, so that we can hear reactions.
This is a question primarily for Quinn, and it may just reflect my own ignorance, but you show two very impressive graphs of colonial versus financial capital, colonialism. The vertical axis had no labels on it. And I was rather confused by the fact that financial capitalism was declining, but colonialism was increasing dramatically towards the 21st century. Not the conventional view, to my knowledge. I mean,
Easily explained.
yeah, I mean, you know, the Indians are, we got rid of them a long time ago. So
Yeah, the answer to that.
can you explain
Sure.
explain what I don't understand?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Just keep going back on that side, and then we'll come back on this side.
Just very brief question. Can you talk a bit about, you, Anush, actually, and then everybody else perhaps, the euro, right?
Which euro?
The euro, the ECB, so you may be treating it as a national currency, but then I want to pull back. What about regional arrangements, right? Maybe Chiang Mai, which may or may not be a success, but it's not just national versus global, right? And it could be a trajectory as well. So thank you.
My turn. I want to ask a question regarding. So first, we'll talk about national currency. About potentially that the dollar is preferred in many ways. But my observation is that is most emerging market in fact have become much more sort of self-sufficient by developing a much better domestic bond market, right? So the best way to deal with financial crisis not actually rely on potential help from dollar system, because dollar system, frankly, put some constraint on many emerging market. So natural is to develop the domestic bond market, which many countries have done so successfully. However, even with that, dollar has been more and more important in my view, right? Whether initially through petrodollar or through liquidity constraint imposed after Asian financial crisis, and even after 2008, when most countries no longer, in fact, most of the debt issuance go toward emerging market, right? Dollar, in fact, throughout the whole time has been, in fact, my view has not diminished at all in terms of importance. So my question in that case is probably a question about U.S. financial system has been very strong, right? Whether through the equity bull market or through the bigger balance sheet expansion or through the great, in my view, very strong fiscal policy, right? In the recent few years, right? So my question in that case is the economic health and financial health of the U.S. economy probably play a very, very important role in continued resilience of U.S. dollar system. So is there any comment on that? So it's kind of my observation on that.
Thanks to all the panelists for some really interesting presentations. I've got a couple of comments kind of across the panel. Mehrsa, I just wanted to flag, something you probably are exploring in this book in progress, but in terms of that Nobel Prize lecture and that joint awarding to Myrdal and Hayek, something that's really interesting. I know some scholars who've looked at the archival records of the Nobel Prize deliberations have noted that Myrdal and Hayek were awarded the prize together as a kind of political compromise, right?
Absolutely.
For balance,
Myrdal
which I
was like
think
the
is
Swedish, he was their guy, and they're like, if we put Myrdal in it, then we can give it to Hayek.
exactly, which is interesting in terms of the dynamics
And they both
of that
refused it. They both
prize.
said that you shouldn't give this prize.
Exactly. And when Myrdal's prize was announced, Albert Hirschman wrote in his diary, "There goes my chances for the Nobel Prize." I study Hirschman in my work, and I love that Edelman points that out in his biography of Hirschman, that he knew that Myrdal had taken his thunder, and that was it. To Perry, I'm looking forward to reading the new book. Couple of thoughts. The kind of picture of the stitching together of the global financial safety net that you're describing with the emergence of the FEMA program, I think is a really important realization of South Korea's aspirations when it held leadership of the G20. When South Korea had the G20 presidency in 2010, the government put forward a proposal, right, for a permanent standing swap facility that would be institutionalized. And that was torpedoed by the US, among other actors. And it's interesting to see the way that proposal ultimately sees the light of day much later on, as you described, though, in this very uneven way, with the key countries getting permanent access on a longer term basis. And as you point out, global South countries getting it on a much kind of sketchier and more contingent basis. But I think that that's part of a larger story that I've tried to tell in my work, among other people, of the emergence of a very uneven, multi-layered global financial safety net that not only involves things like standing swap facilities, but also bilateral swap arrangements, emergency liquidity windows by the IMF and other actors, and a variety of smaller scale liquidity financing facilities among countries in the global South, so that this story is really embedded in a much more multi-layered global financial safety net that's been emerging since the crisis of 2008. Just one other thing I wanted to just note. I have a different take on Keynes's national self-sufficiency essay, the 1933 essay. I don't think it's so anomalous in the context of Keynes's broader work, that he long had a concern about the ramifications of liquid short-term financial flows. I don't think he was just trying to put England in a different kind of position. At the time when he was writing, he wrote so much about the need to control capital on both ends. And I think that's an important feature of the national self-sufficiency essay, that it really doesn't stand apart from the corpus of Keynes's work. And just last thing I wanted to say to Quinn, enjoyed the presentation. Oh, okay. I think Hilferding's Finance, Capital and Lenin's Imperialism are, of course, hugely important works in the study of imperialism. I know you were focusing on more current work, but I'd be interested to see you in other work engage those treatments. Thanks.
Maybe I'll answer first, because I think mine are really quick ones. So first, the question up front, just my sloppy captioning, but that's a Google Ngram, which takes the corpus of books and printed material scanned by Google and then shows the relative word frequency. So the y-axis wouldn't have been very useful. It would say something like 0.0005 or something, but it just shows the relative frequency in print of financial imperialism as a category and settler colonialism having once been roughly equal to this eclipsing of one. The point was, as a historian, thinking about the categories that people use to understand the past. And so even as you say, formal colonialism and imperialism might be gone, but what terms do we turn to now to try to understand what has happened in the past and the way that that might still continue as legacies in the present? And then to the question about Hilferding, I have a really nice anecdote about that, which is I'm part of this small thing called History and Political Economy Project, and we get money from the Hewlett Foundation. And one of the things we're doing this year is we're doing an affordable translation of Hilferding's Finance Capital,
That's awesome.
because it's been like $50 plus on Routledge for far too long. So there's going to be a new translation on Verso, done by the translator of Marx's Capital, the Penguin translation of Marx's Capital. So definitely bringing that back into the conversation.
Can I request an audible of that?
Sure.
So, Anna, the euro. So regionalism. I'll just tell you what Kindleberger thought about that. He was really worried about the European payment system, which then morphed into the euro, because he thought because he's a key currency guy, and he says the important thing is for all these different current countries to kind of connect themselves up with the dollar, and you're breaking up the world trade system, and he's worried about the European countries are going to trade with each other instead of trading in the global system, and so he was worried about that. Okay, now it was his student, Mundell, okay, who got the Nobel Prize for the euro in 1999, I think it was. There was a little conference that Mundell put together honoring his mentor, Kindleberger. It seemed like it worked okay. Stabilizing the euro and the dollar together, okay, is like stabilizing the sterling against the dollar in the previous. So it worked okay. It didn't, in fact, fragment the global system too much, okay, and also the euro is not as good as the dollar, so for global purposes. So this reference that you're making, so I'm moving on to the. I think it's important to, well, maybe I'll take the last question first, and then I'll go back to you. This idea that yes, the safety net is uneven. To say the word that it's uneven is to say that somehow it's not fair or it should be even. The key currency idea is that there's sort of a hierarchical character to this thing, okay? And so the safety nets in one place are going to be different than the safety nets in another place, and you wouldn't expect them to be the same. Okay, unless you had a Westphalian view of the world, okay, in which you think that it's just all 150, equal countries, okay, and that's just not how the monetary and the financial system work. So it's not surprising. So I don't say uneven, I say hierarchical, okay, which is uneven, But and yes, all those other dimensions of it in my other classes, I talk about all those other dimensions of it. Here it's 10 minutes. One of the important things that has been happening, in addition to the access that the emerging markets now have to global capital markets, which is now being tested by tightening monetary policy in the U.S., and this is the way the system grows through elasticity and then discipline. The countries in the global south, many of them now have much more developed financial systems than they used to. Okay, and so it used to be that the only borrower in these countries that could conceivably tap global markets was in fact the state itself. Okay, but now the champions, the oil companies and so forth, can tap the global capital markets, and they are doing it. And as a consequence, the sovereign is tapping local capital markets, and so you're seeing a density of financial development in the global south that you kind of hadn't seen before, and that ties in a little bit with maybe what Anush was looking for, okay, where you are having intermediation happening locally, okay, that is now possible, okay, in a way that was not so possible before, watch this space. It's being tested at the moment. This period of zero interest rate policy that we had for the last decade, okay, led to a lot of crazy things happening. This is what my talk is going to be about tomorrow, about ZIRP, and now we're not in ZIRP anymore, and I don't think that all of this expansion of lending to the global south was just zero interest rate policy creating bad loans. Crypto was, okay, but not. I think this will survive, okay. That there will be permanent, and I'll explain that tomorrow, okay, on somebody else's time.
In the interest of time, I just want to say just to respond to the comment about the developing of local financial bond markets in the global south, or financial markets, bond markets, and so on. And I agree with Perry's point that there has been some development, obviously, but there's still a scale issue. Let me give you an example from India. The largest Indian firms cannot find banks large enough even consortia of banks large enough to borrow from. So they end up borrowing abroad in the dollar markets, right? The so-called national champions. Now that is, so notwithstanding all the development that's happened, you still have, and of course on the other side, you have private equity firms and other firms more than happy to lend to them. So we are still doing this. There's a long way to go in terms of the development of that, and this is straightforward kind of who's going to do the intermediation. Is it domestic? Is it local? And so on. So yeah.
I think probably we should call it to a halt.
Wait, do you wanna give Mehrsa?
Oh, yes, sorry,
No,
did you?
I'm fine, no.
Okay, I wanna just say that I am around all 3 days. And I'm on 3 other panels, they're working me hard. So if you didn't get your question answered here, ask it next time. Or ask me in the hall, I'm around.
Is that right?
Yeah.